It's just crazy. It's just crazy. Okay. All right. Welcome. Let's just start the way we should start every Bible study, with a video. See if I can get sound going on this. It took me forever to put that together for you guys, but I hope that was instructive. Right. Matt, did your kids grow up watching The Prince of Egypt? Or was that before their time?
No, that was not familiar to me.
Okay. Well, it should be. It's awesome. So today we're going to jump into the actual plagues, right? I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. So where we left it off last week was a special word that meant the vindication of God. Do y'all remember what that word was we were talking about last week? It's a special word. Begins with theodicy. So last week we were talking about theodicy, this question of like, why does God allow suffering in the world? And like, that's a relevant question, it's a relevant question where people are waking up today, seeing news out of Ukraine. Why does God let suffering exist? And so this is the beginning of God's response. Now I'm going to give you some different perspectives. I'm not going to tell you how to interpret all of these things, but I want to give you some different perspectives and some background and try to tie some things together. One of the perspectives, this is my warning, my trigger warning. One of the perspectives is that they're naturally occurring events. Then one begets the next, that begets the next, that begets the next. Like if there's, let's say, algae bloom, a red bloom in the Nile River, which can occur, which kills things like frogs. And then you have like thousands of dead frogs that would beget flies, that would beget like pestilence, that would beget all of these other things. I'm going to give you several perspectives. But ultimately, it's wrong to read Exodus as pure history And it's wrong to try to read it too scientifically. The story of Exodus, even like there are historical books, like the book of Kings and Second Kings is trying to give us the story. This is what happened. But Exodus is more than just history. It's more than historical notes. It's theology. It's trying to tell us something about the nature of God. So through all this, if we get bogged down in the science of things, we're going to miss the big story. So Pharaoh says no, right? Pharaoh says, I will not let my people go. And again, Pharaoh is a term we use often because that's the word that pops up in the Bible most often. But we should call him king, right? Not some weird subset. This is the king, and he's king of the universe, king from his perspective of all the world. You know, he's the ruler of the world, not the free world. It's his world. Moses and Aaron did just what the Lord had commanded. He raised his staff in the presence of Pharaoh and his officials and struck the water of the Nile. And all the water was changed into blood. And the fish in the Nile died, and the river smelled so bad the Egyptians could not drink it. Blood was everywhere. Tell me about the Nile River. It's everything. Tell me more about that, Matt.
It was the source of everything. It was the source of food, it was the source of travel, it was the source of water for crops, it was everything.
The Nile is life itself. The Nile is synonymous with life. Oh. Come on. But the Egyptian magicians did the same things by their secret arts, and Pharaoh's heart became hard. He would not listen to Moses and Aaron. Instead, he turned and went to his palace and did not take even this into his heart. And all the Egyptians dug along the Nile to get drinking water because they could not drink water out of the river. I love this picture from outer space of the Nile, right? There's this famous bend that's like a real strange, because of the geology of the land, but there's this massive like horseshoe in the middle of it. It's like way out of the way, it goes like way into the desert. But you can see that like it is life itself, that life teems, you know, within a mile to 2 mile radius, mile to 2 mile range on either side of the banks of the river. That it establishes all life. People can only live on either end. When you walk past the green area, right, it's endless desert. It's nothingness, wasteland. Not just teeming with life, like abundant life. There are crocodiles. There are like now crocodiles. There are not now hippopotamuses, right? All of the animals of the wild kingdom. And you see what would be called the lower Nile, which is the northern part. Lower Nile is the northern part. That's the delta where it's all spilling. And that's where the Israelites are located. We'll get into more. And it's gorgeous, teeming with life. This is where societies have been built for thousands of years at this point. There's already been 2,000 years of history. By the time we get to Moses, there's 2,000 years of history, of Egyptian history already. The pyramids, I have another video of the plagues. It's kind of a more contemporary video and looks really cool. But it shows like the pyramids under construction. But that's false. The pyramids were already constructed. The pyramids were already ancient by the time Moses goes. Like civilizations have already lived here for 1,000 generations. The ancient Egyptians called it Ar, or Ur, meaning black, a reference to the rich, dark sediment that the Nile's waters carried from the Horn of Africa northward and deposited on the flooded riverbanks. You know, we call it the Black Belt. And once in a while, I'll talk to someone from my family, or I'll talk to someone not from Alabama, and I'll say, oh, my first church was in the Black Belt. And people get like really offended, like, oh man, that's a horrible thing to call it. It's like, no, I'm not referring to like the people. I'm referring to the black soil, right? The earth. I mean, where I lived in Eutaw, Alabama in the 1850s, at the height of slavery in America, was the wealthiest county in America because it had that rich, dark, black soil where cotton could be produced, where they could go and plant and harvest. And, you know, horrible, terrible humanitarian, you know, disaster, but it was there because of the soil. Every aspect of life in Egypt depends on the river. Not just food and resources, land for agriculture, but also the means of travel, right? Critical for the transportation of building materials, literally bringing life out of the desert. Then the Lord said to Moses, tell Aaron, stretch out your hand with your staff over the streams and canals and ponds. Oh yeah, let's just sit with the Nile River just for one more second. Water is a profound image in the Old Testament. That God is going to be the one that's like, you know, what do we say in Psalm 23? The Lord is my shepherd. He maketh me to lie down beside still waters. The Israelite people are not seafaring people. As a matter of fact, we've talked about this a lot. The Philistines are seafaring people. The Philistine ancient history, the mythology around the Philistines were they were people who come from the sea, like who would literally come up out of the sea. So there's some archaeologists that think maybe they had been travelers, maybe they had been fleeing from other areas and come over in boats, you know, come over from Greece or Turkey and sailed down, but they literally arrived from the sea, come out of the sea. Israelites are pastoral people. They're people like 2 feet on the earth, right? They're shepherds. And the sea is a place of chaos, of the unknown, right? The sea is a place where Jonah is going to get swallowed by a whale, or Paul is going to be shipwrecked, right? These are not, even the Sea of Galilee, which is a very small lake. The Sea of Galilee, which like maybe in a rowboat you could row across pretty easily, is terrifying. Now, the Sea of Galilee is known for having like sudden bursts of high wind. There are these big plateaus overlooking the sea. And so wind could come out of nowhere, roll down, cause these big storms. Kind of surprising. When you're in tiny little fishing boats, not if you were in a big old boat, but you wouldn't have a big old boat in the Sea of Galilee because it'd be completely unnecessary. So it's only scary, you know, 4-foot waves are only scary when you're in a 2-foot boat. You know what I mean? Just for perspective. God, part of the idea of God is separating the chaos at the beginning of all creation and holding back the waters of chaos, pushing back. This is what they're referred to as the waters of chaos, and it's subduing them. We talked last week about Noah and how like the sins of the people became so great that God released his hand and let the waters of chaos back in, and the world is flooding all over again. Are y'all familiar with the Epic of Gilgamesh? The Epic of Gilgamesh is a very similar story to the story of Noah and the flood, where Gilgamesh goes and he actually has to go down and like eat some weed that he finds in the bottom of the ocean that kind of helps him. But anyway, all that to say, it's like this ancient mythologies, not just our mythologies, but ancient mythologies are all around the waters of chaos flooding the world. And God is going to start this series of actions proclaiming God's dominance. God is establishing not just, I think through the plagues, what we're going to see is God's creating a new narrative, saying Pharaoh is not God. The Egyptian gods, Ra is not God, right? Osiris is not God. There is a God of all things, a God over life itself. You revere and you worship the Nile River as life, as God, but I have control over your river itself. I can turn your river into blood. I can transform the thing that you depend on every single day for every single thing. I can transform it because that's the power of the living God. So think of it not just as, oh man, we don't have anything fresh to drink. He's saying, I am establishing dominance over creation itself. I am the one who can release chaos and control it. So God transforms water into blood. What about the Israelites? Do they have fresh water? They don't. So at this point too, we don't see any distinction, right? The Israelites and the Egyptians, water into blood. The next one, he says, tell Aaron, stretch out your hand with your staff over the streams and canals and ponds and make frogs come up on the land of Egypt. What is the significance of frogs? You can fry up their legs. Have you ever fried frogs' legs?
No.
Oh,
Are you,
I've eaten
Matt, you've eaten them?
But they don't.
You've eaten them?
Yeah.
Let's go back one more second, just to the Nile. Let's say one more thing. Let me just give you this perspective too, because you will hear people always trying to justify things in the Old Testament, people trying to make sense. And sometimes things can't be made sense of. But there is one question where people say, could it have been a red algae bloom? I don't know if y'all have been to Florida when there's like a red algae bloom or something, but it's like highly toxic, right? The water literally turns red. And it like, I think you were telling me about your sister Annie that was having some problems breathing just from having paddling, right? Like she went out in her kayak and paddled around it and just breathing in those fumes. Lou, what is it that causes a red algae bloom?
It's contamination of the water, basically it's pollution. Causes higher levels of something that the algae needs to proliferate.
There becomes an imbalance in the ecosystem. Something gets introduced and imbalance, and the algae just starts growing like crazy, and it becomes highly, highly toxic. So one of the scientific questions was, could it have been? The Nile River has been known to have algae blooms before. Could it have been that there's like an algae bloom and this popped up? Something that might not last for weeks or years, something that could last for days. They could cause fish to die, cause like living things not wanting to be in that water, like frogs. So then ribbity come up out of the water. Could be. So frogs. I've always found the frogs one really strange. It's just weird. I've heard of a couple different instances in human history where it's recorded there have been storms that sweep up, like a storm, like a tornado comes through and sweeps up like a pond. And then like somewhere else, it's like just a heavy rainstorm and it just starts raining frogs. And it's a really terrifying and strange experience. But I think there's at least a couple recorded experiences of people saying like it rained frogs.
That's also happened with fish.
It's also happened with fish. Something slightly different. I do hear like every once in a while when it gets too cold in Florida, you'll see like iguanas just falling out of trees. But that's different entirely. It's not raining iguanas. They're just falling iguanas. Either way, don't go to Florida. Heket is the god of the Nile River, often depicted with a frog head. Does anybody know anything about Heket, the frog god? Does anybody know anything about Osiris and Set? Can you tell me a little bit about the stories of Osiris and Set? They were brothers. And what does Set do to Osiris? He kills him. He doesn't just kill him. He like chops him up into 1,000 pieces and throws his body into the Nile River, where Heket, the god of the Nile River, helps put Osiris back together again, because Heket is the god also of life and resurrection. Osiris comes back to life so that he can like have a baby with his sister. Kind of gets weird after that. But the river is a symbol of life. And Heket, the frog god, is this god of resurrection who can call life back, right? In ancient Egyptian religion mythology, the frog-headed goddess was personified as she personified generation, birth, fertility. Heket was sometimes depicted with the body of a frog, or the frog amulets were common in ancient Egypt as charms. Frogs were thought to be sacred and not to be killed. Kind of makes sense. You see frogs, you see tadpoles, you see the way they're born, you see the fertility of frogs, you see the abundance of frogs, right? Kind of makes sense. They're seen as sacred. Pharaoh summons Moses and Aaron and says, pray to the Lord to take the frogs away from me and my people, and I will let your people go and offer sacrifices. Like, get the frogs gone. It's horrible. Moses said to Pharaoh, I leave to you the honor of setting the time for me to pray for you and your officials and your people, that you and your houses may be rid of frogs, except for those that remain in the Nile. Oh, this is interesting. Moses says, I can get rid of the frogs anytime I want. So you name the time and place. It's kind of like a challenge to him, right? That we worship the real and true and living God. The frogs aren't naturally occurring. The frogs, right, are here because of us. You tell me the time and place, we will remove them. So after Moses and Aaron left Pharaoh, Moses cried out to the Lord about the frogs. And the Lord did what Moses asked. The frogs died. Now that's not exactly what I think Pharaoh had in mind, right? We have a plague of frogs. Frogs are everywhere. What we want are the frogs to go back into the Nile. We didn't exactly want just all the frogs to die. Like now we just have dead frogs everywhere. Have y'all ever been around when 17-year cicadas come out? Have you all ever been around the 17-year cicadas? I was 18 when the 17-year cicadas came out in West Virginia, and I've missed every other cycle since then. And they come out in different parts, in different regions, but it came out biblically. I mean, it came out like locusts, when we're going to get to that. I mean, it was just incredible. And they come and they mate, and they're so loud. And, I remember trying to mow the lawn. It's like you walk outside and you get 15 attached to your shirt. All of a sudden you run back inside, or you try to drive, and it's almost impossible trying to drive down the interstate because your windshield wiper becomes so smeared with bugs and you can't see anything. I mean, it's like driving through a storm. But then they all die. So then, like, the whole time you're like, oh man, I want them to go away. I want them to go away. It's terrible. But then they all die. And you literally have to go and get shovels and fill up trash bags. You go to the bottoms of trees and you're just like shoveling garbage bags full of dead locusts, right? Which is also ill pleasant. It's like, I don't want to be shoveling piles of dead cicadas. I don't want to be shoveling piles of dead frogs. They were piled in heaps and the land reeked. But when Pharaoh saw that there was a relief, he hardened his heart and would not let Moses and Aaron go. This is where people say, okay, could one have then begat the other? Could there have been a red algae bloom? And that would force animals like frogs out of the water. And then, of course, it's going to kill them. They all die. And what would happen if you have piles and piles of dead frogs? Flies are coming next. Here come the flies. Tell Aaron, God says, stretch out your staff and strike the dust of the ground. And throughout the land of Egypt, the dust will become gnats. They did this. When Aaron stretched out his hand with the staff and struck the dust of the ground, gnats came on the people and the animal. And the dust throughout the land of Egypt became gnats. But when the magicians tried to produce the gnats by their secret arts, they could not. Okay, up to this point, the magicians have been holding pace. Up to this point, the magicians could make their staffs turn into snakes. They can make water turn into blood. They could make frogs. Apparently, they can make frogs appear out of nowhere. Since the gnats were on the people and animals everywhere, the magician said to Pharaoh, "This is the finger of God." But Pharaoh's heart was hard. He would not listen, just as the Lord had said. This word in Hebrew could mean biting gnat, or it could mean tick. It's the same word for tick. I don't know. I have a buddy. There's a new kind of disease that we haven't, we don't have Lyme disease in Alabama, which is awesome. Mostly don't have Lyme disease. But there's another kind of disease that's coming into Alabama. They call it the vampire tick, where it bites you and it makes you allergic to mammalian meat. So it makes you allergic to animals that are mammals, like cow, right? So then if you eat something like a steak, it physically makes you sick. Like it kind of does something. It changes. There's an enzyme that transforms you. So like I have a buddy now who's vegetarian because he can't eat meat because he's bitten by one of these ticks. Which, I mean, being vegetarian isn't the worst thing. It's probably good for the planet, but like kind of surprising. So this word, kin, resides especially in the body and clothes, while the latter is in the hair of the head, the eyebrows, and the beard. Both cause irritation of the skin, intense itching of the scalp, and the rest of the body. In the hot and humid regions along the banks of the Nile, these insects have always been abundant. Hence the Egyptian custom of shaving their heads and removing all their body hair. Typically, when you see images of Egyptians, especially of pharaohs, right, they're very clean shaven, not like what you would see among the pastoral Israelites with big, heavy beards and long hair, right? They have the Egyptian custom of shaving their body hair. You even tend to see people being bald, and sometimes even women having shaved heads. For priests, it was obligatory in order to avoid being infested by these unwelcome insects. Part of being a priest is being ritually clean. And so part of that, being pure, is like making sure you don't have gnats and biting flies. We went to visit my sister in Brazil and just had a horrible experience with mosquitoes. I think there must be something that over time, like your body gets used to whatever enzymes are in the mosquitoes in Brazil. But we went to their farm and it was awful. I mean, one night Katie counted like 60 mosquito bites on my back, and we're spraying ourselves with all this stuff and just can't repel the mosquitoes. And it wasn't just like a bite, oh, it's kind of discomforting. Like you draw blood. I mean, I'd say like the mosquitoes are so large they'd pick you up and carry you back to the lair to save you for later. So we drove like 15 hours across the country to go to the beach. To like we rented a boat. We're going to go around coral reef. You know, we're going from island to island. We're going to go see if there are coral reefs. We're going to go see, like, live at the beach for a day. It's going to be like this glorious adventure. And on the way, I asked my sister, I'm like, I'm in a lot of pain. Do you have something like Benadryl to kind of take the edge off all these bites? She says, sure, no problem. She said, you should take, she said, you know, 2 might be a lot. You should maybe take 1 of these pills. So I took 1. And we walked down the cobblestones towards the beach. And as we were walking, I could feel like the cobblestones getting kind of like wavy, where I was like, I've never taken LSD, but it's like, is this what LSD is like? It's like something is happening here. Yeah, it's like super Benadryl. And so like I got on the boat, I was like, I'm falling asleep. And like I just slept for like 12 hours. Like I had this huge sunburn on part of my arm because I'd fallen asleep in the shade with one arm out in the sunshine. And then like they'd rouse me, and Katie'd get me like, oh, come on, we're at this amazing like water spot. Like you got to get in the water. And I like fall into the water. I like swim for 20 minutes and get back in, fall back asleep. I asked my sister, like, what the hell did you give me? She's like, oh yeah, it's like Benadryl. I was like, that's not Benadryl. She's like, yeah, like if you were bitten by a poisonous snake, like that's what we would give you. I was like, in what universe? I was like, do you know what Benadryl is? But like the physical discomfort of like getting bitten by those mosquitoes. A few days later, like after I like recovered, a few days later, we were at another beach and it was just being attacked and attacked by mosquitoes. And so I would just like stand in the water up to my neck, you know, off the beach, where it's like, I'm just not going to leave the water, because like as soon as you get out, they're attacking. I mean, have y'all ever been in a place where you just feel that overwhelmed and it's itchy and scratchy and painful?
And then they have different layers. They got the mosquitoes up here, and then the mosquitoes down here are ready to go to you, and then the ones who take their place.
When in the Marine Corps on Paris Island, we had sand fleas there.
Sand fleas.
Yeah, and there was the bites and the sting all over your body.
Did you go?
They won't-
You go to Paris Island?
They
Yeah,
won't let you up.
Horrible experience.
had a horrible
They
experience.
won't let you scratch
But
you.
at the end of it, you can just stand there while something is completely devouring, just not moving.
Yeah,
Sand fleas will just sit there and chew on
you learned how to suffer greatly.
Yeah.
And I think that's the point of like the flies are coming, these fleas, you know, are coming, and it's just suffering. Everyone's suffering. Everyone is suffering. Everyone. It doesn't say at this point the Israelites are not immune from this. It says the flies are everywhere. Here's an image of a bald-headed priest. So there's like an Egyptian relief. You see like this image of a clean-shaven priest. That's why I shave my head, so that you know, at least at our Eucharist, there's no contamination, right? Additionally, gnats covered every animal. So there'd be no quote unquote clean animals to sacrifice, since the duties of the priest include performing sacrificial liturgical services to the gods. We can't service the gods now. Again, it's larger than just the discomfort of the people. It's not that God's just making Pharaoh physically uncomfortable. God is disrupting the cosmic order, saying, I'm establishing my dominance over all things. You can't sacrifice to your God. I'm going to shut down your churches. I'm going to shut down your temples. A great part of Egyptian theology involves keeping the gods happy. So in a sense, it's an attack on the gods, not one particular, but all of them. Their entire religious system is at risk. I just saw this and I thought it was wonderful. The medical document from the ancient Near East suggested one way to get rid of gnats is to cover oneself in fish spawn. So I really like the idea of the priests going and getting fish roe, fish guts, and just smearing it all over their bodies, trying to protect themselves from the flies and the gnats. Egyptian reliefs oftentimes show servants with large plumes of feathers intended to keep cool as well as keeping insects at bay. I mean, y'all have seen these images of like the pharaoh, the king lounging and being fanned by these giant fans. Those efforts are now worthless. Gnats have seeped into his palace through his servants, his magicians, and every little breeze that had been brought in had brought in some of the dust, right? They're being stirred. And again, so there's this idea, the frogs die, red algae bloom, frogs die, gnats come. But the Bible's saying they're coming from the dust itself. They're just rising up out of the earth. Here you see Egyptian reliefs, right? Of the pharaoh being fanned. This is just what I was saying. Both body lice and fleas can theoretically transmit disease, which causes the bubonic plague. So, if there was an infestation with lice, that could have set the stage for the later plagues, such as boils, pestilence, right? It could be setting things up later on down the road. This is what it looks like during the 17-year cicadas, right? When the 17-year cicadas come out, it's just like overwhelming in every way. So there's the lice, the ticks. That's what comes out, the biting gnats. They come out first. And then the next plague is going to be the flies. If you do not let my people go, I will send swarms of flies on you and your officials, on your people and into your homes. The houses of the Egyptians will be full of flies. Even the ground will be covered with them. But on that day, I will do differently with the land of Goshen. This is the first time something's different with the land of Goshen. This is where the Israelites are. No swarm of flies will be there, so that you will know that I, the Lord, am in this land. I will make a distinction between my people and your people. Now that's pretty radical difference too. There's now a force field surrounding my people, right? So we're being attacked, we're being overwhelmed, we're being run over, and we can look and see the Israelites are being left alone. The story begins to change. When the Septuagint, y'all, what's the Septuagint? Somebody tell me. Why do we call it the Septuagint?
Translated by 70 people.
That's right. So like one of the first combinations of the Old Testament, the idea was they had 70 of the most learned rabbis, the most brilliant of all the rabbis. They went to like 70 different rooms in the house, and they said, we're each going to write out the Old Testament. And all 70 of them wrote out the Old Testament word for word, and they came together and realized it was all perfectly the same, inspired by the word of God. So that was the first compilation, the first time they took the Torah and the, historical books and the genealogies and put them all together. It's called the Septuagint because it's put together by these 70 rabbis. The Septuagint, the scholars used a word meaning dog fly. These were blood-sucking flies that were known to inflict painful bites. They've been described as hurling themselves like a javelin, fastening themselves upon your body, especially the edges of your eyelids, disfiguring them by swelling and produced by their sting. I don't know, have y'all ever been to Africa? Have y'all ever been on safari? I remember there are these biting flies. They look like horse flies, right? These are different than mosquitoes. Like they look like a big old horse fly, but they were biting. And I remember like being in the back of this Jeep and like it hurt so bad when they would bite you. I mean, it felt like a bee sting, but like, very, very intense hearing pain. And I remember just being in so much pain. And when we were driving, they were just behind us. They're like following us. And I remember like looking and seeing like, God damn, like, can't you drive faster? Like the flies are upon us. I talk about this great book that I read recently by Boyd Vardy. I talked about it in my sermon this morning, but he wrote this book called The Lion Tracker's Guide to Life. And he talks about the first time that he's introduced to bees. He wants to learn how to do beekeeping in the wild of Africa. And he puts on this bee suit and there's like a little gap, like it's a little too short. There's a gap that exposes his ankle. So he puts on these thick socks in hopes that that'll be enough. And these are Africanized bees. So these are what we'd call in America like killer bees. And he said, so they go to this tree and they're trying to open it up to get into this honey. And he says he's just surrounded by this swarm. And it's just like this loud swarm all around him in every which way. And it's like a living being, it's like this living thing, this hive that's like swarming, crawling all over his face mask, crawling all over his suit and his gloves and everything. And then he said he felt one sting on his ankle. And he's like, oh no. He said there was like a pause, like everything stopped for just a second. And the swarm went from his head to his ankles. And he said he just started feeling these stings around his ankles. And then at one point he felt something sting him in his leg. And then he saw a bee inside his suit. And he said, it was just madness and chaos. And he's with this guy who's like trying to help him. He's like, okay, I will now light the smoke. He's like, too late for that. And then finally the guy who's with him is like, run for your life. And they're like running away. And they jump in the Jeep and they're driving away. And he's like, drive as fast as you can. It's like, they will never stop. Like the bees will not stop following you. This is a known thing about Africanized bees, right? That you're supposed to like run into a body of water or something because the bees, and I've even heard of stories of bees following somebody home and waiting outside their house. That's just mean. That's just vicious. This fits into the continuing saga of God is not just doing things at the Egyptians. God is unmaking creation, right? This, we got to think about this in the biggest scope, in the biggest sense, cosmic. God is unmaking creation. Pharaoh, you think yourself king, you think yourself God. Egypt, you think yourself the kingdom of the gods. I am going to show you real power now. The frogs come from water. The gnats come from the dust of the earth. The flies are coming from the air. Water, earth, air, right? All these aspects of creation are involved in God's lessons for Egypt. Creation itself is uncoming, is unwinding. It's also worth mentioning here that there's no staff mentioned, right? The first couple plagues, Moses takes his staff and touches the water, right? He's doing things. He takes his staff and he swirls it in the dust and gnats rise up. This is no longer a magic trick. This is no longer Moses doing something, conjuring something. God is now acting on God's behalf. Power. There's also a new development, right? This time the Lord adds, but on that day, I will deal differently with the land of Goshen. First time there's an explicit exemption for the people of Israel. That God does not recognize Egypt as a land. This was one of the bold things about Russia and Putin, right? Where Putin came in and said, I don't recognize Ukraine as a separate land. I don't recognize Ukraine. They're just part of us. Like, how can I invade our own country? Ukraine is Russia, or at least the eastern part of Ukraine. He's saying, I recognize them as sovereign territories. The fear, of course, is that other countries would do the same. The fear would be that China would stand up and say, well, we don't recognize Taiwan. They don't have a right to exist as a separate country because they're not a separate country, because they're our country. And where does that end? North Korea says we don't recognize the legitimacy of South Korea because there's only one Korean people. It's ours. So we're going to take nuclear weapons and destroy, whatever cities we have to destroy because we don't recognize it. Where does the story end? But God stands up and says, I don't recognize Egypt as a sovereign territory. You are nothing but part of my creation. Lou.
I'm reading the book of Exodus along with this for the Good Book Club. And one of the interesting things, I'm reading it from Jewish translation of the scriptures. And at this point in time, the word for the people of God changes from Hebrews to Israelites, which is another kind of a really funny thing. They're called the Hebrews in like the first 3 or 4 plagues, but suddenly they become the Israelites, which is a people with a land and a future. And
that's interesting.
Changes in the text.
So you're seeing the story starting to come alive in all kinds of ways, like starting to root the people in Israel. While when they're in Egypt, they're rooted as Hebrew people, and now they're rooted by this land feature, right?
Right.
That's interesting. And the Lord did this. Dense swarms of flies poured into Pharaoh's palace and into his house throughout Egypt. The land was ruined. And Pharaoh summoned him and said, go, sacrifice to your God here in the land. He says, go sacrifice to your God in our land. What's the problem with that? Why is it the wrong place?
They need to leave.
Why do they need to leave?
God told them.
Because God's telling them to leave, right? I'm rescuing you from Egypt. That's the point. The point is it's a prison break. And what does Pharaoh say? Go worship here where we can see you. Go, fine. Okay, your God's God. Appease your God here while I can keep you under a watchful eye. But no, Moses says that would not be right. The sacrifices we offer to God would be detestable to the Egyptians. And if we offer our sacrifice there detestable in their eyes, will they not stone us? We must take a 3 days journey into the wilderness to offer our sacrifice to the Lord our God as he commands. Why would the Israelite sacrifice be detestable to the Egyptians? Killing animals. I mean, there are animal sacrifice in Egypt, so they're sacrificing. Why else?
Well, because it's only one God, maybe, not several gods.
It's not one of the publicly sanctioned gods. We're not worshiping Ra. We're not worshiping Osiris. We're not worshiping any gods you recognize. We're worshiping a whole nother one. And that might piss off their gods. That might unsettle the gods that they worship. The issue seems to be the fact the Israelites might sacrifice an animal that the Egyptians believed to be sacred. Sacrificing such an animal would be an affront to the Egyptian gods. It's possible that they, wanting to protect their gods, will take matters into their own hands. The most likely animal to cause problems would be a ram. Rams were considered sacred. Once a year, one was sacrificed to Ra in an elaborate religious ceremony, and the Israelites could not duplicate this. So they're going to go and do it all wrong. In addition to that, it's believed that some gods preferred goats and abhorred sheep, and for others, it was the opposite. So you know what? It's like no matter what you do, you're going to screw it up, and then we're all going to get in trouble. Moses, having lived as an Egyptian for 40 years, would have been aware of these nuances. The solution, he thinks, is to take a 3-day journey. A 3-day journey, assuming about 20 miles a day, is about 60 miles into the wilderness. 60 miles would take them beyond the borders of the Egyptian army, right? We need to get far enough away that the army can't come and slaughter us. We need to be outside of your reach, which then presents this other problem, right? We're going to go and step outside of your reach, outside of your dominion, so that we can keep going. And this becomes the crisis for Pharaoh. Up to this point, what are your reflections? What are your reflections up to this point on the plagues?
Why didn't he just wreak havoc on Pharaoh instead of all the Egyptian people?
Yeah, why not just inflict it on Pharaoh? Yeah, why do you think,
Wouldn't
Kevin?
that be sufficient?
Yeah,
Kind of reminds me of sanctions, you know,
Yeah.
you do a little
Sanctions.
bit at a time trying to get somebody to change their mind.
yeah. No, this isn't, I mean, look, there's so much that's complicated about this. But right, part of like World War II, part of Hitler's strategy of bombing London was we're going to take it to the people. It's not enough to like defeat you in the battlefield. We're going to take it to your homes. We're going to take it to your people. We're going to make your suffering so great that you will lay down your arms in the streets, that your people, we will break your will to survive. And it's horrible, right? And what happened in England? What was the result? Like Winston Churchill, they had the exact opposite reaction. The English said, like, screw this guy. Like, they dug down in the reserves. But that's what we're doing with sanctions right now to Russia. They're talking about removing Russia from the SWIFT program. The SWIFT is the international banking program where banks communicate with each other so that banks can lend and borrow money and exchange money. The part of the sanctions, like, okay, we're going to sanction Putin. We're going to sanction the oligarchs, all of his buddies who are like really wealthy and corrupt. But we're also going to unsettle their entire economy, right? Because we don't see any justification for going into Ukraine. We also don't see any reason that the Russian people want to invade Ukraine. The Russian people have no anger, hatred, malice. There's no justification for attacking their friends, their cousins, their neighbors. And so part of these sanctions is, and part of the conversation around the SWIFT program, have y'all heard about this?
Yeah.
Is we're going to upset their entire economy so that every single Russian is going to feel the financial impact of this war. So that the Russians themselves are going to go out and protest and reject the leadership, right? The idea is like, there's a couple ways for this to end. There's like several bad ways for this to end. But what's the easiest way for this to end? Is regime change in Russia. The easiest way to end is for a coup and to overthrow Putin. Now, Putin he built allegedly $1 billion palace on the seashore. It kind of looks like if you're looking at a map, it kind of looks like he'd be looking across the sea to Ukraine, right? But he built like this, $1 billion, unimaginable wealth. And we probably won't ever get to see it, the inside of it, unless he's toppled, unless there's a coup that overthrows him. And then everyone's going to go and storm the Putin palace. Why else do you think God is doing this, right? Why is God, what else are your other reflections about the plague so far?
From me, it gives an alternative narrative. You know, in the Bible, it says he hardened Pharaoh's heart. And that always bothered me because, I mean, why should God play favorites? I mean, if he is actively hardening Pharaoh's heart, then he's the kind of God who takes revenge.
Mm.
Whereas if you look at it from your viewpoint, that he is actually reinforcing the creative forces in the world, that's a kind of a positive way of looking at it as opposed to a negative.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
I'm gonna show you my power. Great, you now accepted it. Yeah, but I'm gonna show off a little bit more. So I'm gonna purposefully harden your heart so I can show off a little bit more.
Yeah,
It just doesn't seem right.
yeah, exactly. Exactly. I mean, God says at the outset of this, I'm going to make it so that everyone knows the full extent of my power. I'm going to rescue you, but I'm going to do it in such a way that every single person alive understands that there's one true living God. I don't know, like, again, we read the Bible not as a science tome. There is one theory that I kind of like. There's a theory that around Noah's flood. Now, there's like, I don't think God flooded the whole world. I don't think like God's like, well, this this is the worst. I made a real mistake. We're going to flood the whole world. There's like no evidence that like there's a giant flood that covered the whole world. I don't think like Mount Everest was underwater and everything was covered up, every single animal except for the ones on the ship.
China didn't seem to notice.
China didn't seem to notice. I don't think that like that's exactly what happened. There is a theory though that a long time ago, after the Fertile Crescent had been established and people were beginning to migrate through the Near East, people were starting to create these agricultural centers and were starting to gather as communities and villages. So like it's the beginning of civilization. There is a theory, and there is like some geologic discovery that of the creation of the Black Sea. Now, if you look at the Black Sea, there's like the Mediterranean Sea, which is essentially an ocean, right? The Mediterranean Sea is just massively humongous. In the land, and if you look at it, there's like this little gateway, there's like this little entry into the Black Sea, and then the Black Sea is massive and huge. And so with the geology of the land, there's some idea that it was like a natural earthen dam, and that it was eroding and getting thinner and thinner. And then that earthen dam that was like naturally forming broke, and the Mediterranean Sea started pouring through, and then would like fill up in what would become the Black Sea. And something on that scale, like that geologic scale, like when that erupted, it would have had the impact of 10,000 nuclear bombs going off. It would have had the impact of causing earthquakes, of causing like massive earthquakes for hundreds of miles in every direction, for literally, at least over the area, the humongous vast space that it would become. It would change the atmosphere of that at the time. Like there would be thunderstorms and lightning, and you'd be feeling the earth like shattering and shaking. And part of the idea is it's like spilling in, and anybody like living right below that, like, God bless you, like, peace out. But the people who are living further off, right, are going to start to feel the warning signs. They're going to start to feel the rumble of the earth. They're going to start to feel the shaking. They're going to see the rain starting. And it's going to feel as though the world is in perpetual rainstorm. It's going to feel like the world is being flooded, and flooded at a rate where if you have enough time, maybe you have a couple oxen in a wagon and some wheels, you can load your animals onto that wagon. You can start to pack your stuff and start to move. And it's hard to say because this is pre-literacy. This is pre the time when we're writing stuff down. Go ahead, Brett.
Think about that. Those flood myths are
Yeah.
and they kind of coincide with different types of things. So you've got ice melting, water.
Ice melting, water.
Warm air coming up, so you've got thunderstorms like you're talking about.
There's a lot happening. And could it have been that a prominent family was able to pack up everything and every living animal that they could find and pack up all their belongings? There are not just a flood myth, there are dozens of flood mythologies from around that area coming after that time, not written in real time, written 100 generations later, because that's how things were done, right? But could there have been a cataclysmic event, a worldwide event that was so profound and so intense and so world changing that it was seared as a story into the minds of 100 generations. You know what I mean? The stories that my grandfather taught me, like I hold in my heart. I don't know if they're going to get passed on to my kids, and probably not to my grandkids. The stories that he passed on to me were rich and good, and there's one or two that I'll definitely tell my kids in time, but I don't know if it'll make it to my grandkids. So for a story to pass down 100 generations, it would have to be so massive that there's only one way to understand the universe. It's before this event and after this event. There's only one way to like live is in relationship with this flood, because it changed the world. It, you know, the Black Sea is larger than nations. Like it's larger than like, you know, several states, probably larger than Alabama.
Mistaken, I went to the Cherokee Indian
Yeah.
Museum there in Cherokee, North Carolina. I believe there's a flood myth in Native American countries too.
Sure.
But we don't know where those people might have come from, so.
The whole thing is like so interesting, right?
It's fascinating.
It is so complicated. And so the other thing is the Passover, this event is one of those major global events that's going to be seared into the minds and consciousness of the Israelite people for all generations until this Sunday when we celebrate the Passover during our own Eucharist, right? That we still observe it. But it must have been so huge, so transformative that the Israelite people for 100 generations until it's written down for the first time, they're saying, we can't understand life except before the Passover and after the Passover. So the events that are happening are so cosmic in scale. It's getting seared literally into our humanity. Does that make sense? And so we think of the plagues, again, not just as, oh, these things that were like mildly discomforting. Oh, we had some flies for a few days and I really don't like the flies. It's like the earth itself changed. If there were to be a nuclear war, right? If there were to be nuclear war, the only way we could understand it is before and after. Before we had nuclear war, nuclear holocaust, right? I'm going to show you another video that I'm going to show you another video that I think is kind of a maybe a little bit more realistic. Now, again, it shows the pyramids under construction, which, you know, the filmmakers weren't perfect because what do we know about the ancient pyramids? They would have already been there for like thousands of years. Drama. That's a little more dramatic than the first video, huh?
Man, he thought of everything.
He thought of everything.
Oh, what a miserable time. I was legal, I would be mad too.
You know, we're going to pick up next time with the next. We'll pick up next week with the plagues and keep marching through them. And look, I know we're taking a long time to get through Exodus, but this is just the first half. There's Exodus is a story. It's a two-part story. Exodus is the first half, leaving, and the second half is what happens after you've left Egypt, right? So we're going to start again next week with the rest of the plagues.